you, Jim. Well, we now have our last speaker, Jay, who's going to close for us with an energetic talk.
Thanks, Jim. And, it's great to be working with WFP. I think you are really at the forefront of breaking down boundaries as to how we do our job to solve the challenges. I'm not an expert, and I'm certainly not a nutritionist, and definitely not an economist. But I've had the good fortune of having been in social movements, having been in government, and also having been in business. But right now, I'm just a parent and a father of 3 children. And I am terrified of the world that we are living in. And so when I stand here, I'm standing here in that role. And, the wonderful thing about sun, it's like the sun. We all see it. We all know it's good. But we can't touch it. We can't feel it. And I think one of the challenges of this group is to make it real. And when we talk about it becoming real, it must change lives of people for the better. It must help us put a stop to this unnecessary statistic that we have just heard from Jim. 200 million children who have suffered irreversible damage, even though we have the expertise, we even have the money, we have the business model, we have the technology to stop it. And I think that's why we get together in conferences like this. And just to clarify something that I said earlier, I was talking in a very particular context when I said don't negotiate. Mandela said, we don't negotiate with our friends, we negotiate with our enemies. It was in our context in South Africa. But I think the principle, if I had to extrapolate it here, is that we cannot just be with people who agree with us, because then we don't make progress. In fact, we need to be with people who are important stakeholders with whom we may not agree. But part of the challenge of making progress is actually being able to work through those differences and find common ground. And what we're trying to do in SUN is create the space for where we can find common ground. The other thing that I'd really like to point out, it's very important that we drive the type of evidence-based investment that we're talking, whether you're a donor, you're a private sector company, or you're a government. But let me caution on one thing, that, I've been to many conferences of what I call the professional development industry. And this industry grows by leaps and bounds. And to a point where I describe it as the poverty elite, the merchant class of poverty. And it's not really driven by people who are actually the beneficiaries. It's driven by people who are professionals. And I think we must avoid this tendency to drive development down a path where it's not really addressing the needs of those people who need our help the most. So I think there needs to be a context to this. I think that one of the most useful things out of this meeting that we had today, and I refer to the book that Gordon has written, 1 Billion Hungry, is understanding who this 1 billion is. And from what we hear today from this conference is that a large number of the people, the billion that are hungry, are subsistence farmers. And a large percentage of those subsistence farmers are women. And we know that if we improve their productivity, we improve their skills and effectiveness, that we use the best global practice that we have in this room, and we implement it at a local level in a way that improves their incomes, then there's a radically important lever that we are starting to hold in our hands to change the lives of those millions of children that today are stunted, because we know from all evidence that women will put their incomes into health, education, and nutrition. So I think that it's very important that this is a recognition that these smallholder farmers are in fact part of a private sector. And in fact, what I hope in the next business conference, we can have a huge percentage of organizations these development enterprises that represent these women. And there are many of them out there that I know of personally. So, and part of them that we work with, parts of civil society that actually call themselves development enterprises, like the Nandi Foundation that I know. Part of the organizations like BRAC that should be here. They're business organizations. They may be social businesses, but they represent a particular way of seeing development and the sustainability of development. So, I think that in Africa, I've been talking to a group called Empowering Women in Agriculture. Can we have them here at the meeting? And so I think that when I'm looking at the Sun Business Network, we're looking at those that will become members. But there are important voices that may not become members because we've set the terms of engagement at a level to which they cannot comply with whatever reason. Doesn't mean we don't talk to them, because it's like trying to go into battle with one arm tied behind your back. So I think that we've got to have a sense of people who are members, but we're not creating an organization purely to go and parade ourselves as this is the membership organization and how important we are. We are trying to solve a critical challenge. And in that process, we cannot exclude anyone, even people we may disagree with, or people we may have differences with it. And so I think that, in my mind, is that the ideological mantras that we hear about this, are they in, are they out? I think somehow we need to put that behind and focus our attention on what do we do? Who are the interests that we are trying to address? Whose interests are those? And who do we need in this room? And I think if we clarify that, the terms of investment and of engagement flow from that. And so will the theory of change, so will be the delivery science, and so would be our vision and strategy. So I am, in a sense, reflecting also in a similar predicament that we had in the mid-90s in telecommunications in Africa, when I was a minister of telecommunications. And we convened a meeting of African telecommunications ministers and said, why is it that sub-Saharan Africa has less telephones than the city of New York or the city of Tokyo? And we came to one conclusion, that is our problem. And what was the problem? We hadn't created a set of policies, of laws, and of regulation that could give predictability and certainty to people that would invest, because we recognized, all of us, that this investment could be driven by the private sector. And it required the appropriate environment for us to create. And what changed the game? It was a simple innovation of a prepaid card. And today, Africa is the fastest growing telecoms market in the world. 500 million people with cell phones. Not one $8. So if we're looking at game changers for how we want to crowd in investment into nutrition, let's think about those game changers and what will be the levers that we need to get into place that allows us to crowd in, whether it's private sector investment or whether it's ODA or whether it's government revenues in the public delivery systems, or whether it is the private sector. So I think that we've got to start thinking in a creative way about these financial mechanisms. And having spent a lot of time for 10 years chairing the Southern African Development Bank, I can understand that there are these mechanisms that can be developed. And this is one of the great capacities of the private sector. So if I'm looking at the more specific objectives, what I would like to see coming out of a Sun Business Network, first of all, is creating these markets for these small-scale farmers. And what do we need to improve their capacity? How do we transfer skills to them? How do we connect them to markets in which they can raise their incomes? Secondly, is looking at these new financial instruments. And can we create instruments in collaboration between us that can crowd in investment into interventions around nutrition? The third is that there's a very simple thing we said, staple food fortification. Can we complete that? Can we get to say, can we finish the iodization of salt, or looking at double fortification of salt, because we know what the evidence is in terms of their benefits. And then I would think that we need very explicit statements on the issue of breastfeeding coming out of the business network, because there needs to be a specific declaration that says we are committed to 6 months of exclusive breastfeeding. We are committed to continuous breastfeeding in addition to complementary foods for children from 6 to 24 months. So if we are explicit in what we are saying, then it deflects people who would like to use certain reasons to argue that business has no role in nutrition. But you need to be very explicit about that up front. And then coming out of the Hunger Summit, there was a commitment around sort of pre-competitive models of sharing knowledge, of collaboration, particularly around the issue of monitoring, of evaluation, of seeing the evidence and the development impact of interventions business is making. For example, with Brack and the Renata model around sprinkles in Bangladesh, or the Grameen Bank and Danone having done a fortified yogurt. We need to see more evidence of that demonstrates that there is real value in business being involved in nutrition. And so these are some ideas that I think, and I think that I concur with many of the speakers before me. I think what we should do at the next meeting of this type of business alliance is actually create a lot more space for us to have conversations between ourselves, a lot more space for a more participatory process rather than many speeches. And I think at the end of the day, to arrive at a point where we can have a sort of plan of action of what we are committing, very much like when you go to the CGI. You're coming here with a commitment of what you are contributing to the solution. And what we are able to do is use this platform to consolidate those solution-driven initiatives that will fundamentally change lives of people in the world. Thank you very much.